In the state of Texas, we have a city named West. In the year 2013, a man was driving in the highway, and a few hundred feet to the left of him, he saw a building on fire. So he took out his cell phone and started recording this.
Oh, you okay?
Dad?
You okay?
Dad, I can't hear.
Come here.
I can't hear. Get out of here. Please get out of here.
Oh my God.
Please get out of here.
Thankfully, this father and child do not get hurt. But around this explosion, 15 people die. And most of these guys were firefighters. When experts began to examine why the fire started and why it exploded like that, they realized that this warehouse held a lot of ammonium nitrate, and this facility had 240 tons of it. Ammonium nitrate is a type of chemical fertilizer, and the facility or warehouse where this stuff is being kept has to be extremely safe. If it's not kept safe, an explosion like this is inevitable. Another insane explosion that was caused by the same material was the Beirut explosion in the year 2020. But in Beirut, there was 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate. The Beirut explosion had 10 times the amount of ammonium nitrate than West Texas. The same type of explosion could be seen in 2004 in the Iranian city Neyshapour. 7 wagons of a train had 400 tons of ammonium nitrate, and they engulfed in flames and caused an insane explosion. And the explosion caused 300 people to die, and more than 460 people got injured. It was estimated that the power of this explosion was 180 tons. But let's get back to the main story. All these things we're explaining to you guys was to get an understanding about these chemicals and to tell you the main story, the Bhopal disaster in India. Bhopal is a city in central India, a city that was not that important through Indian history. But when you get to the 1950s, all of a sudden, this city becomes an industry hotspot, and it becomes a very industrial city in India. So now it's important. But the city is very unequal. More than 90% of the population lives in extreme poverty, and a very small percentage of people are very wealthy. 20% of the population don't even have proper housing. They live in these shacks, or should I call them slums, that are made from garbage. If you've seen our favela video, you got to know the slums of Rio de Janeiro. But if you compare the favelas to Bhopal slums, they're not even comparable. And the favelas look like a proper town compared to these. The slums of Bhopal are called the Kucha. We get to the year 1984. When the city of Bhopal has grown a bunch, and it has 1 million people in population, but still 20% of the population lives in the Kuchal. The biggest company in the city of Bhopal is in the north side, right in the middle of the Kuchal, a company named Union Carbide, and that shows most of the workers at Union Carbide live in the Kuchal. In the 1980s, the world was changing in terms of farming, and new types of pesticides were being chemically made in laboratories, and farming was going through a revolution. Alongside the pesticides, there were a lot of chemical fertilizers being invented as well, and Union Carbide was one of the companies that was producing the strongest pesticides that everyone in the world wanted, so they had customers all over the globe. Most of the employees were extremely poor people from the Kuchal, so the workforce was extremely cheap. It was very cheap to produce it, and they had customers everywhere. The pesticides used today is not even comparable to the pesticides used in the 1980s. So when they were producing these pesticides, they would put the strongest chemicals to make it as effective as possible. Things that were extremely harmful to plants and animals, especially humans. But humans don't realize it until it's too late. In the 1980s, Union Carbide was producing a pesticide where if you gave it a spoonful of it to a rhino, they would drop dead. That's how powerful it was. Just imagine how dangerous the gas of this was. If you lived through the 1980s, your body is most likely used to this type of pesticides and you've ate produce that had this on it. But you shouldn't worry because it wasn't that insane and it wasn't in production for that long for it to have a hugely negative effect. Before we continue, let's learn a little bit about Union Carbide. This company is American and they have factories in the US, France, and India. But the factories in the US and France are not even comparable to the one in India. The factory in the Western countries are extremely modern. Every safety precaution is taken care of. But in Bhopal, everything was wrong. Sometimes the employees didn't even have shoes on. You could say that Union Carbide had purchased the politicians and the people in charge of Bhopal, and they could do whatever they wanted with the people of the city. Like reporters from different parts of India were not allowed near Union Carbide factory because they didn't truly want to show what is going on. Between the years 1979 to 1984, 25 employees of Union Carbide were killed because of safety cuts. A lot of funding was cut, especially in the safety department, so most of these people were killed because of that. It didn't matter how many people sued what they said to the authority. Nobody in that government cared. And when you get to 1984, this factory does not have any type of safety in it. Everything has been shut off just to make money. Union Carbide did everything to cut corners in this factory. When you get to 1984, the company is like driving downhill with a semi-truck, but your brakes are not working, but you're going downhill in full speed. Just imagine the city of Bhopal as this semi. When you get to December 2nd, 1984, this semi-truck has gotten to the end of the hill and it has to hit a wall. In the basement of this factory, there were 3 tanks that was filled up with methyl isocyanate. This was one of the main ingredients to produce these powerful pesticides. And it's a chemical that's extremely reactive, and there's always a chance for explosions. One of the safety valves that was cut in corner and wasn't there anymore started leaking water into the tank underground. A tank underground that was supposed to have a pressure of about 4 psi now has a pressure of more than 50 psi. While the pressure is rising, the temperature of the tank is also rising. And you get to a point where the tank is more than 300 degrees Celsius. The extreme pressures starts shaking the tank, and after, it starts to leak out and the gas starts to leak into the environment. The people that were working in the factory, especially the people that lived around the factory, started to smell something that was terrible. And after, their eyes started to burn to a point where they couldn't even see anymore. The people were dying from toxicity, and one by one, they would drop down. It's kind of like spraying pesticides on a bunch of insects on your produce, but this time, it's the people of the city of Bhopal, and they're dropping dead one by one. This starts to leak for hours on end, and after 2 hours, a giant cloud of methyl isocyanate is hovering around the city of Bhopal, especially above the factory itself, where most of the people are living in the Kuchal. In the cloud that was hovering, there was 45,000 kilograms of this chemical, a deadly cloud that's hovering above 1 million people. The first night, the hospital in the city was completely packed. People that couldn't properly breathe and they couldn't see. Until the next day, more than 55,000 people are in the hospitals. 2 days passes and this cloud is still hovering over the city, and the amount of people that couldn't properly breathe was up to 170,000 people. And most of the 170,000 people are the people living in the Kuchal, right near the factory. There are different statistics on how many people died because of this. Most people suggest that 16,000 people died because of it. But there are some locals and some reporters that say a lot of the population, especially the population in the Kuchal, weren't even accounted for. So the death toll is much more than 20,000 dead. Alongside the 16 to 20,000 people that were killed, tens of thousands of different animals were killed because of this pesticides leaking into the air. And the terrifying part is that even trees and plants were being killed. That's how powerful the gas was. You have to count it like this, where a city of 1 million people, alongside all its animals and plants, were sprayed with pesticides. And that's not a modern pesticides. This is one of the strongest pesticides that were made in the 1980s. But the problems didn't end there. Tens of thousands of people started to have respiratory problems. Because of this gas, their lungs had weakened drastically. Unfortunately, a lot of women that gave birth in the city of Bhopal, a higher percentage of them were disabled, and that's all because of the gas exposure they had in the 1980s. Anybody that drank the water of Bhopal, they were pretty much drinking toxic waste. 39 years has passed, and experts still believe that the water in Bhopal is dirty and nobody should drink it. When Corona started to go around the world and the virus got to Bhopal, a higher percentage of people were being killed in the city of Bhopal rather than the rest of India. And 75% of the people that died because of COVID were people that lived through the 1984 disaster. So who paid for this type of disaster? Nobody. The people of Bhopal. Union Carbide kept making excuses to extend the things, and the government of India or the city of Bhopal wouldn't say anything because Union Carbide was that powerful. If some type of disaster like this happened in the factories in the US or France, that would have been the end of the company. But since it happened in a third world country like India, where the government doesn't even care about its own people, Union Carbide survived easily. But news came out, especially Western news media, that was covering it heavily and dissing Union Carbide. This is when the company had a meeting to figure out what should we do to make ourselves look better. This is when they gave $470 million to the families that lost their loved ones in this disaster. But that came out to about $800 per person. Since Union Carbide was getting a lot of backlash, they decided to leave the factory in India alone because it wasn't worth it anymore. Nowadays, if you go to Bhopal, there's always a type of protest against Union Carbide and how they damaged the livelihood of over 1 million people, and they only were awarded $800 per person. But even with all the complaining and the protesting, nobody seems to listen.